I went down to the basement of the party and found my wife kissing her boss. When she saw me, she recoiled as if the shock could erase what I'd already seen. My heart sank, but my decision came instantly. I went back upstairs and left, leaving the rest of the night and the wedding behind. I didn't say anything, I didn't need to. She tried to explain it to me days later, but the truth had already dissolved any ties. The boss, of course, didn't want to know anything about her beyond that night. Alone, she had to face the void she'd created. I slowly rebuilt myself and found a new love, someone who brought me respect, lightness, and the certainty that loyalty is not negotiable. When she came to me, repentant, I listened silently and replied firmly, "I forgive." But our chapter ended there, with no turning back. And it was there that she realized the weight of her choice. I'm not sure what hurt more, if it was the image that never left my mind, that frozen moment when everything fell apart, or if it was the silence that followed. A silence that screamed against the walls of the house, in the absence of her laughter, in the glasses that remained two, even when only one was used. She walked away, it's true. But it wasn't she who left, it was me. I left because it was no longer mine. The love I had left turned to dust in that basement, the reflection of a betrayal as simple as it was unforgivable. One kiss. One kiss was enough to shatter an entire story. And what hurt me most wasn't the infidelity itself, but the coldness in her eyes when our eyes met. There was no guilt there. There was only fear. Fear of being caught, not regret for what she did. And that was what destroyed me. That night, I sat in the car for long minutes, unable to start it. My eyes were open, but it was as if I were staring into an abyss. An abyss she herself had dug beneath our feet. I relived every moment, the beginning of the party, the way she held my hand, the way she smiled at the guests, as if nothing was about to happen. And then, the basement. The muffled music, the dim lights, the smell of alcohol and perfume mingling. And the two of them. A kiss. A touch. A look that wasn't meant for me. I wondered if they'd done this before. If this was their first kiss or their 1000th. But deep down, it didn't matter. In that moment, my story with her ended. And it was in that same instant that my story with me began. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't confront her. I went upstairs, greeted everyone I saw, got in my car, and left. I didn't need to see anything else. I didn't need to hear excuses. I didn't need fights or scandals. What I needed, what I deserved, was peace. And that's what I went looking for. The following days were a blur of ignored messages, declined calls, and attempts to contact me that only increased my exhaustion. She wrote long texts. She called me everything you can imagine, cold, proud, cowardly. But I only read one thing, fear. She wasn't desperate for love. She was desperate to maintain her comfort. To realize too late that what we had was rare. That I was rare. But I was learning to value myself, even with my heart torn apart. Forgiveness didn't come easily. It didn't come with words or promises. It came with time. It came with sleepless nights, with meetings with friends who tried to distract me, with the deafening silence of the empty house. But it came. One day, I woke up and realized I could remember her face without feeling pain. That I could hear our wedding music without suffocating. That the memory of her smiling was no longer a knife in my chest, but an old photograph, beautiful, but distant. And it was at that moment that I realized I was ready to live another story. A different story. A light story. Without fear. Without doubts. With someone who knew the value of being by my side, not behind my back. She came back. They always do. One day, months later, she knocked on my door. Her eyes were puffy and the words were on the tip of her tongue. But she didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me like someone carrying the world on their shoulders and finally understanding that the world she lost was better than anything she found later. She asked to come in. We sat. The silence weighed heavily for a few minutes until she broke down. She said she hadn't been sleeping well, that she couldn't forgive herself. That she even missed my flaws. That his touch had no soul. That his kiss had no roots. That what she had with me was true love, and that now she knew it. I listened. Silently. Not with anger, but with something much sadder, indifference. When someone you love disappoints you, what follows the pain is emptiness. And it's in that emptiness that you learn to move on. I didn't say much. I said I forgave her, yes. Because holding a grudge is like carrying a chain that binds you to the past. But forgiving isn't forgetting. And much less going back. Forgiving, for me, was understanding that she had a choice. And she chose what she chose. And now she had to live with it. I told her that today I'm a different man. That I've found peace. That I'm no longer angry, but I also have no room for her. The love she wanted back no longer exists. It died in the basement, along with the promises she broke. And that's when she truly cried. Because she finally realized she'd lost something she'd never get back. Months later, rummaging through some old boxes, I found a letter from her, never sent. It was sandwiched between two books, yellowed with age. A letter written before the wedding, in which she expressed fear. She said she didn't know if she was ready, but that she loved me. She said she wanted to try. At the time, that would have made me insecure, perhaps even made her give up. But today, reading that letter felt like closing a circle. Because I understood that perhaps she never knew what true love was. Or she did know and was afraid. And, out of fear, she destroyed something she'll never find again. Today, my life is moving in a different direction. I met someone who doesn't look away, who holds my hand firmly, who doesn't need attention from others to feel alive. With her, silence is comfortable, laughter is light, and the future doesn't scare. Sometimes I think about the past. But not with pain. With gratitude. Because it was pain that pushed me out of what was slowly killing me. It was betrayal that saved me from continuing to live a lie. And it was forgiveness that freed me. Not from her, but from myself. What she feels now, I don't know. I don't follow, I don't ask, I don't wish her ill. But I imagine that, every now and then, she opens a random drawer, finds an old photo of us, and smiles sadly. Not for what she experienced, but for what she didn't experience. Because sometimes regret isn't for something we did, but for something we destroyed without understanding its value. And there's no going back. Not after the basement. Not after the silence. Not after the forgiveness without return. But perhaps most curious is what I found inside that letter. Something I never noticed the first time I read it. A nearly erased sentence at the end, as if she'd written it and then tried to cross it out, but couldn't bring herself to. If I ever lose you, I hope you can forgive me. Because I'll never forgive myself. And that's when I realized that, deep down, she already knew. Even before it all happened. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized, it will be exposed. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on real emotions and choices. The goal is clear, to show how a single decision can destroy everything built with love, loyalty, and respect. Get ready. The story you're about to hear is powerful, intense, and may touch wounds many hide. Take a deep breath, and be ready for a story. Shocking. Lucas met Emma in a small bookstore downtown on an afternoon that promised absolutely nothing. It was drizzling, and he held a bent umbrella and a worn copy of a book he'd been trying to find for months. She was sitting on the floor, leaning against a shelf of classics, reading leisurely, her loose hair hiding part of her face. It was she who initiated conversation, pointing to the book in her hands and saying she'd already read it 3 times. The conversation was awkward, full of pauses and suppressed smiles, but when he left the store, her number was written on the back cover, next to a small pencil-drawn heart. There was something about her that seemed to belong to a calmer time, a woman who blended elegance with a rare lightness, a kind of emotional maturity that enchanted at first sight. Emma, for her part, saw in Lucas something she'd never encountered in the men she'd been involved with before. He was simple, but not mediocre. He spoke calmly, looked people in the eye, listened more than he spoke, and seemed to have a restless soul, the kind that carries old pain in silence. In the first few months, she fell in love not only with the man he was, but with the way he made her feel, safe, respected, interesting. Lucas didn't need to be the center of attention, he was the kind of man who stood out precisely for knowing how to step back, for valuing others. And Emma, who had come from unstable, game-playing relationships, found in him a haven that finally felt quiet, stable, and real. They began seeing each other frequently. The relationship blossomed quickly, but with no rush. Dinners at home, Sundays in the park, afternoons without commitments with books scattered on the floor and coffee growing cold on the table. What united them was more than chemistry or desire, it was a deep sense of belonging. When they were together, everything felt light, possible. His family welcomed her naturally, and her friends gradually came to admire him. Lucas was the kind of man who earned everyone's trust with his constant, discreet presence. Emma flourished around him, and for a long time, she was honest in saying she had never been happier. They decided to move in together after a little over a year. They rented an apartment with a modest view of the skyline, but with a balcony big enough for 2 chairs and a plant that Emma insisted on calling our green beginning. The evenings were filled with laughter and plans for the future. They talked about marriage, children, travel. They had a list of countries to visit, books to read together, recipes to try. They created small traditions, wine on Fridays, pancakes on Sundays, old movies on Wednesdays. Even when they argued, and, of course, they did argue, there was respect. They knew how to listen to each other, knew how to compromise. Emma had a more intense temperament, impulsive, often driven by emotions. Lucas was the counterpoint, a more rational man who thought before reacting. The balance between the two seemed perfect. Over time, her commitments increased. Emma's career took off when she received a promotion, which required more time away from home, more travel, and more meetings. Lucas, despite working remotely as a consultant, never complained. On the contrary, he was the one who cooked dinner on days when she arrived exhausted, who took care of the little things around the house, who remembered her family's birthdays, and who waited up just to ask how her day was. He knew that her success didn't diminish his value, he understood that love also meant supporting the other person's growth, even if it cost time and attention. But there were days when her absence was heavy, and he didn't say so. Emma, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of her routine. The pressure of work, the accumulated fatigue, the demands of her new position. There were times when it all seemed too much. Sometimes she felt Lucas was too good, too understanding. And this understanding, instead of reassuring her, began to generate a silent restlessness. Why didn't he demand more? Why didn't he argue more? Somewhere inside her, a doubt grew, was he truly satisfied with everything? Or was he just settling for fear of losing her? She began to question her own emotions. She loved Lucas, but she didn't know if it was the same love as in the beginning. She was tired, confused. And when confusion finds its way into everyday life, it begins to erode what seemed unshakable. The relationship continued, but something began to subtly change. The once long conversations became quick exchanges of information. The spontaneous touches diminished. The goodnight kiss became an almost mechanical habit. Lucas felt it, but he didn't speak. He didn't want to pressure her, didn't want to appear insecure. He knew difficult times exist. He preferred to believe everything was temporary. That their love, so solid, would survive any emotional distance. He remained present, constant. He still made coffee for them both, still tucked her in when she fell asleep on the couch, still bought her flowers for no reason. And she still smiled, still told him she loved him. But there was something in her eyes he couldn't decipher, an absence. And it was this emptiness, disguised as normality, that began to shatter what was real. They set a wedding date after almost 3 years together. It was a natural decision, without excessive euphoria. They wanted something intimate, beautiful, with friends and family. They spent weeks choosing songs, discussing the decorations, and carefully organizing everything. Lucas was excited, but always with that almost reverent care. Emma vacillated between excitement and exhaustion. Sometimes she seemed emotional, other times distant. When he mentioned it, she told him it was just fatigue. That everything was fine. And he believed her. He wanted to believe her. But deep down, something in his gut told him everything wasn't okay. That there was something she wasn't saying. Still, he continued, because that's what he did for her. He believed, he supported, he loved. The days leading up to the wedding were hectic, filled with chores, bachelor parties, appointments, and conflicting schedules. Emma spent more time away due to a last-minute business trip. Lucas patiently handled everything himself, but with a smile on his face. After all, it was for them. It was the beginning of their life together. He wrote his own vows with emotion. He remembered the day he met her, the way she said his name softly, and the look in her eyes as she said, yes, for the first time. He was ready. He was sure. On the day of the party, everything was perfectly set up. The simple yet elegant ballroom, the soft lighting, the smiles everywhere. Emma arrived stunning, wearing a dress that seemed made for her. The first few hours were a parade of hugs, laughter, and toasts. Lucas watched her with that same look he always had, of someone who needed nothing more in the world. Of someone who had everything right there. She smiled too, but there were moments when her eyes would drift off into space for a second. A brief second, but enough to cast shadows in the hearts of those who already love with suspicion. And then came the music. And the dancing. And the greetings. And the toasts, once again. And the minutes-long absences. And the returns with forced smiles. And the glances that lingered too long with people he didn't know so well. But all of this, he supposed, was part of the night. It was just another event, a bit of tension, maybe anxiety, maybe too much to drink. After all, it was their night. The night that would mark the beginning of everything. What Lucas didn't know is that sometimes the beginning of everything begins with the end of something he hasn't yet realized he lost. And the question that will remain in the air until the end of the story is: can true love survive after being betrayed? In the days following the party, Lucas still carried the enchantment of what they had experienced there. The ceremony had been simple, yet charged with meaning. The smiles, the hugs, the vows exchanged between deep gazes. Everything felt right, definitive. He felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Emma, in the early days, also seemed enveloped by that aura of newness. There was a subtle glow about her, as if she were rediscovering home in the details of the house, in the taste of the meals they shared, in the silent touch at night. Lucas saw no reason to suspect anything. He continued his remote work, dedicated himself to the little things he knew were good for her, like leaving loving notes around the house, preparing breakfast before she woke, warming her sheets on the coldest nights. He was a whole man in every gesture, and he believed that was enough. Routine, however, soon took its toll again. The honeymoon had been postponed due to Emma's unavoidable professional commitments. Her work schedule remained intense, with meetings, events, and trips that seemed to increase by the week. Lucas, even though he felt her absence, never complained. He was understanding, patient, and believed their love was strong enough to endure phases like this. He believed this with almost blind faith. They often spent days disconnected, experiencing only the intersections between hurried mornings and tired nights. Emma began sleeping on the couch more often, saying that exhaustion overcame her before she even went upstairs. He tucked her in gently, kissed her forehead, and continued the night as if it were just another passing moment. But there was something about her that was beginning to weigh him down. Emma was different. Less present, less engaged. Her eyes lost focus easily, her mind seemed to wander, even during the simplest conversations. She smiled less, touched less, kissed with an uncomfortable rush. Lucas noticed, but didn't want to misinterpret. He thought she was under pressure, that everything would return to normal. He tried to maintain a balance between supporting and not suffocating. But the cold in his chest began to grow, silently, like a fog that forms without warning. He wasn't sure what it was, but something was off. And it wasn't just her physical absence, it was an absence that went beyond her body, it was as if her soul were somewhere else. Little lies began to emerge. Schedule mismatches, unanswered messages, overused excuses. Emma claimed she'd stayed late for a meeting, but Lucas could see her phone had been off for hours. She said she was with coworkers, but when he asked who, she hesitated. She began carrying her phone on silent, face down, sometimes even in airplane mode. He noticed, but avoided confrontation. He kept everything quiet, afraid of being intrusive, afraid of the response. Instead of questioning, he immersed himself in household chores, in books he never finished, in playlists of songs she used to like. He tried, somehow, to call back that woman who seemed to walk away without a backward glance. Emma started dressing differently. New makeup, clothes she hadn't worn before, lingerie she'd never shown him. Lucas complimented her, tried to get closer, but he realized the compliments bounced back without an echo. The intimacy between them became a dry land, where everything that tried to blossom died before it could sprout. And yet, he continued to love her. He continued to bet. He continued to hope it was just a phase. There were nights he'd wait for her late, preparing her favorite meal, setting the table with candles, trying to recreate the atmosphere that had once brought them together. But she'd arrive late, with red eyes and an almost rehearsed tiredness. She'd say she wasn't hungry. That she just wanted to sleep. And he, lacking the strength to insist, would blow out the candles and eat alone. Weekends became different. Before, they had rituals, coffee together, trips to the grocery store, long walks around the city. Now, she preferred to go out alone to clear her head, or said she had to work. He, once again, accepted it. He thought pressuring her would only push her further away. And it was in this space of permissiveness that everything began to unravel. Lucas began to feel like he was living with a stranger. The house that was once full of voices and laughter became a space of sharp silences and glances that avoided meeting. He tried to talk, tried to schedule dinners, tried to surprise her. But every attempt seemed to hit an invisible wall. Emma was there, but she wasn't. And he was beginning to wonder if she would ever be there again. The questions began to silently haunt him. Did she regret getting married? Was she unhappy? Was she falling in love with someone else? He had no proof, only a persistent intuition that tightened his chest like an uncomfortable premonition. He didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to imagine it. But the fear grew. And fear, when left unspoken, turns to poison. It was on a random Saturday that everything began to become clear, or to fall apart completely. Emma said she was going to a company event. Lucas, tired of silently nursing his anguish, decided to show up unexpectedly. I wanted to see her in action, to remind her she was there. He arrived at the indicated location, but couldn't find her. No one knew if she'd been there. He called, texted, no response. He waited. Hours. When he returned home, she was already in bed, with the light off. He said it had been a tiring day. That his battery was dead. That they'd talk the next day. And he, once again, pretended to believe her. But that night, something inside him snapped. He got out of bed in the middle of the night and went to the sofa where she'd left her purse. He picked up her cell phone. The code was still the same. He hesitated. But then he opened it. And there, In the archived conversations, he found what he'd feared. Photos. Messages. Calls. Schedules. And, most of all, words she no longer spoke to him. Words that had once belonged to their love, now written for someone else. The ground seemed to drop from beneath his feet. His entire body trembled. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply closed his phone, returned to the bedroom, and lay down beside her, his heart broken but his face calm. Like someone deciding, for the last time, to believe in themselves. In the days that followed, she feigned normalcy. She continued smiling, making coffee, saying, "Good morning." He wanted to observe. He wanted to see how far she would go. She didn't notice. She was so wrapped up in her own world that she didn't notice his gaze, the absence behind his habitual gestures. But Lucas already knew. And knowing, for him, was enough. All that was left was to understand why. The answer would come soon. And with it, a weight even greater than that of betrayal. Something Emma carried silently, believing it would never be discovered. And it would be precisely this silence that would begin the end. Lucas remained silent for 2 more days. He said nothing, didn't accuse, didn't confront. He simply observed. Every gesture, every word, every justification. He knew what he had seen, and the weight of it accumulated on his chest like unseen stones. But he didn't want to act impulsively. He needed to understand everything before making any decisions. That Saturday morning, while she was still asleep in her room, he made coffee, sat at the table, and picked up the forgotten letter from the shelf, the one he had never seen before, the one that seemed out of place. A thin envelope, with familiar handwriting. Opening it, he read words she had written long before their marriage, almost like a confession, a warning, a veiled confession from someone who no longer knew who she was. The words were hesitant, as if she wanted to tell him something but feared the consequences. The last sentence was scribbled but still visible: "If I ever lose you, I hope you can forgive me, because I will never forgive myself." Lucas held that paper like someone holding a shard of glass, sharp, fragile, loaded with meaning. That afternoon, he waited for her to arrive. She walked through the door, eyes on her phone, kicked off her shoes in the hallway, and went straight to her bedroom. He remained sitting on the sofa, motionless, until she returned to the living room. When she saw his look, she knew something was wrong. There was an unusual silence there. A silence fraught with finality. He said nothing right away. He simply placed her phone face up on the table. She paled. She tried to say something, but he interrupted her with a calmness that hurt more than any shout. He said he knew. That he had read it. That he had seen it. That she didn't need to hear any explanation. She cried, but there was no drama. There was no more room for it. He simply asked her to be honest, for the first time in a long time. Emma tried to justify herself. She said it was a mistake, that she didn't know how it happened, that she felt confused, pressured, exhausted. That it wasn't a lack of love. Lucas listened without interrupting, but his eyes were already distant. It was as if he were looking at another person, a stranger who used the same voice, the same face, but who was no longer part of his life. He said he forgave her. Definitely. That he wouldn't harbor hatred, that he didn't wish harm, but that from that moment on, there was no longer an us. There was only him. She tried to touch his hand, but he pulled away. He asked her to respect that. To let the silence settle as it should. And finally, he left. No shouting, no bags, no drama. He just left. In the days that followed, Emma tried repeatedly to contact her. Messages, calls, letters. But Lucas didn't respond. He had retreated, not for revenge, but for protection. He needed to heal what had been torn apart. He tried to understand where everything had begun to fall apart, what had been the first step toward the abyss. Until, one sleepless night, he decided to return to his old house to collect some belongings. He didn't want to see her, but he needed to close that cycle with his own eyes. Arriving there, he found her alone, sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by open boxes and scattered papers. She wasn't surprised to see him. She simply looked at him with profound weariness, as if she no longer had the strength to pretend. Emma asked for just a minute. She said she didn't want to convince him of anything, that she knew he was right, but that there was something he needed to know. Something she'd never had the courage to say. Lucas hesitated, but stayed. And that was when she told him. The story was old, even before her marriage. She said that the man she'd gotten involved with wasn't just her boss, but someone she'd had an affair with years ago, long before she met Lucas. An affair she believed was over, dead. But it was rekindled when they started working together again. She said the reunion confused her, stirred things she didn't know still existed within her. That the problem wasn't just desire, but what that man represented, her past, the choices she'd never had the courage to face, the unresolved traumas. And that she'd gotten involved not because she didn't love Lucas, but because of weakness, cowardice, and escape. That she'd cheated because she didn't feel worthy of the life she'd built with him. Because, somewhere in her subconscious, she felt that it was too good. And people like her didn't know how to handle good things. Lucas remained silent for a long time. This wasn't what he expected to hear. What she was revealing wasn't just a momentary mistake, it was an old, barely healed wound that she had dragged into their marriage like a silent virus. His silence was broken when, with trembling hands, she handed him a letter, the same one he had already found, but now with the full version. On the back was a passage that had been missing before. In it, Emma confessed that she had always been afraid to love someone like Lucas. Because he saw a version of herself in her that she couldn't support. Because he loved her completely, but she had only known crooked love, the love that hurts. And by not knowing how to receive true love, she destroyed the only one truly worth loving. The words hit Lucas like a punch. Not because of the revelation itself, but because, in that moment, everything made sense. The absences, the silences, the empty stares, the confusion in her eyes. It wasn't just infidelity, it was self-sabotage. Emma didn't cheat because she didn't love him. She cheated because she didn't love herself. Because she didn't feel worthy of happiness. And he, unknowingly, spent all that time trying to rescue someone who didn't even know if she wanted to be saved. The silence between them lasted for long minutes. Until Lucas said, his voice breaking, that he couldn't be the one to carry her through this process. That he understood her, that he deeply regretted everything, but that she needed to choose now. He said forgiveness had already been given, but that love didn't last. That he could no longer envision a future where they would both be whole. And that, despite everything, he wanted her to find peace, to learn to see herself with more compassion. But that his presence there was over. Emma cried. For the first time, without defending herself, without arguing, without begging. She cried like someone who finally understands what it means to lose. And Lucas left that house for the last time. With a heavy heart, yes. But with the certainty that love also means knowing how to let go. And that sometimes, the greatest act of love is to set someone free to face their own ghosts. Outside, the night was cold. But inside him, a spring was beginning to blossom. Still timid, still painful, but real. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. Something light. Something true. Something possible. Lucas left the house with firm steps, but inside, something still trembled. Emma's revelation, however understandable it might have been in words, didn't lessen the impact of what had been broken. And the clarity of that moment, even filled with empathy, didn't heal. He wasn't indifferent. He was exhausted. There was still love, yes, but it was a love full of cracks, a love that required too much strength to remain standing. And in that moment, he was no longer willing to sustain something that was constantly crumbling. When he got into the car, he sat in the seat for long minutes before starting it. His hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. For the first time, he didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt. But because I knew that if he did, he might not have the courage to truly leave. And he needed to go. He moved to a small apartment on the other side of the city, secluded, quiet, where no one knew him. He took few things with him, a few books, his clothes, a painting he had painted years before, and the old guitar he played on lonely nights. The new routine was dry, practical, almost monastic. He woke early, walked to the bakery, returned, and worked for hours. At night, he read until he fell asleep. He avoided social media, avoided contact with acquaintances. He needed time where he could just be himself, without Emma's shadow in every corner of the house, in every memory of a too recent past. He cut his hair, changed his beard, rearranged the furniture. Not to forget who he was, but to remind himself that it was possible to continue being someone other than the man he had betrayed. Weeks passed. Emma's presence vanished completely. There were no more messages, no more calls. She respected the space he requested. And that, curiously, was what weighed most heavily. Because her silence was no longer an omission, it was acceptance. It was the acknowledgement that, as much as she still loved him, she had arrived too late with the truth. And Lucas, little by little, began to breathe again. Not lightly, but with less pain. Until, one random Sunday, he decided to go to the old bookstore where they had met. It was no longer the same place, but nostalgia drew him there like someone returning to their origins to remember what still exists within them. It was there that he met Clara. She was sitting on the floor, between shelves of poetry, a book on her lap, her eyes closed, as if absorbing each word like music. As he passed, he accidentally tripped over a fallen book, and she laughed. A soft laugh that delicately broke the silence. They apologized to each other simultaneously, and then looked at each other. And that look wasn't sweeping, nor cinematic, it was simple. Warm. Real. They talked for minutes, then hours. They talked about favorite authors, hidden cafes, bad days, and days that are only less bad because we find something beautiful in them. She was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Clara was spontaneous, direct, full of exposed scars, but with a disarming sweetness. And he took his time. He wasn't looking for a replacement. He didn't want to repeat stories. He simply wanted to allow himself something new, without old ghosts lurking. Their encounters became more frequent. Walks, coffees, shared laughter without the need to hide the pain. Clara knew he carried a past. She didn't ask him everything at once, but waited for him to confide. And Lucas, when he told her, didn't romanticize it. He said in no uncertain terms that he was betrayed, deceived, that he felt torn apart inside. But he also said he forgave, that he chose not to harbor hatred, because he knew that kind of poison sickens those who harbor it. Clara didn't judge him. She simply said he seemed like someone who had learned to love properly. And that she would respect his time. Those words, so simple, did more for him than any comfort or advice from a friend. From that moment on, something inside Lucas began to heal more firmly. Emma, meanwhile, was following a different path. She continued living in the same house, within the same walls, but now plunged into a painful silence. Little by little, she realized that what remained of her without Lucas was a constant weariness. Nothing made sense anymore. Friends drifted away. Some out of respect for Lucas. Others out of silent disapproval. Even her mother, with whom she had never had an easy relationship, showed coldness in the face of everything. Emma's betrayal wasn't just a break between the two, it was a rupture with everything that sustained her. She began attending therapy. Not to try to win him back, but because she knew she needed to understand how she got to that point. He discovered patterns within himself he had never faced before. Self-sabotage, fears, insecurities. Facing all of this was like tearing off her skin. But she persisted. Because, even alone, she wanted to learn to be someone who wouldn't destroy anyone else, not even herself. Late one night, Emma was sorting through old boxes. She decided to get rid of a lot of things. Among the papers and photos, she found a picture of her and Lucas, sitting on the porch, smiling as if the whole world could fit there. She stared at the photo for long minutes, until, on the back, she noticed a phrase he'd written, "I choose you even on the bad days." It pierced her chest like a knife. It wasn't just longing. It was guilt. It was awareness. It was the realization that she had been chosen by someone who truly loved her, and that she couldn't hold on to that choice. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and typed a message. Long, sincere, with no intention of reply. She said she didn't want to get back together. She knew he was moving on with his life. But she needed him to know how much she had changed, how much she still thought about the pain she'd caused, how much she wished he were at peace. Lucas read the message the next day, when he was in the park with Clara. He felt neither anger nor sadness. Just a gentle melancholy. He showed the message to Clara. She read it carefully, then held his hand and said that sometimes the past comes to visit us just to confirm we made the right choice to move forward. A few weeks later, the two met again by chance at an art fair. Emma was alone. Lucas was accompanied by Clara. Their eyes met. There was a silence of seconds, as if time had stopped. Emma smiled, with a lump in her throat, and waved discreetly. Lucas smiled back. Clara, noticing, gently squeezed his hand. They passed Emma and continued on. And she stood there, standing, watching the man who had once been hers, now belonging to another story, lighter, more just. That night, Emma returned home and wrote one last letter. She didn't send it. She just kept it. It was short but true. She said she would love Lucas forever, but that she had learned that love is not enough if it doesn't come with loyalty, courage, and truth. And that losing someone like him was the greatest punishment and, at the same time, the greatest lesson of her life. Lucas, upon arriving home with Clara, prepared dinner and put on some soft music. They sat at the table, shared wine, and laughed over simple things. And for a moment, he looked into her eyes and knew that this place, this new life, was the fresh start he deserved. There was no more pain, only the memory of her. And even memories hurt less when the present offered peace. That was the last time Lucas thought intensely about Emma. Because, in that moment, he understood that some stories end not because of a lack of love, but because love needs to be respected. And when that doesn't happen, the best thing to do is walk away, not out of weakness, but out of dignity. And the silence he feared so much was now shelter. The morning breeze blew through the light curtains on the porch where Lucas had placed a small table with 2 chairs. It was his new favorite corner of the house, where time slowed down and thoughts flowed more clearly. In recent months, life had taken on a different rhythm, quieter, more stable, as if the emotional chaos that had consumed him were finally dissolving into small portions of peace. Clara, with her calm and honest way of being, had become a presence that didn't suffocate, that didn't demand more than he was ready to give. And perhaps that was precisely what helped him move forward, the absence of demands, the welcoming without demands, the freedom to be imperfect without fear of not being enough. They didn't complete each other, they weren't halves that fit together, they were wholes that respected each other. And, at that stage in Lucas's life, being respected was more important than being loved. There were days when he still woke in the middle of the night with strange sensations, memories that came like flashes, but not like open wounds. They were more like scars that itch at specific moments, memories that came uninvited but no longer controlled the present. It was impossible to simply erase the traumas, nor pretend they hadn't shaped part of who he was now. Lucas had changed. He was no longer the man he used to be, the one who tried to keep everything running even when the gears were already grinding, the one who silenced his own worries in the name of artificial harmony. Now, he knew his own limits, knew when to stop, when to retreat, when to protect what he held most dear, his sanity. Clara, on the other hand, also carried her own ghosts, and what united them was precisely the fact that they didn't use their pain as crutches, but as starting points to better understand themselves and each other. There were nights when she, too, would lose herself in memories, and Lucas, instead of trying to fix her, simply remained by her side. They were partners, accomplices in a silent reconstruction, in a love that didn't need to be constantly declared to be felt. Neither sought perfection. They simply sought not to lose themselves again. On the other side of this story, Emma was immersed in an internal process more arduous than she imagined. After writing her last letter, the one she never sent, she decided to distance herself from everything that connected her to the past. She changed jobs, neighborhoods, and social circles. She began attending support groups, delved deeper into therapy, and read compulsively about human behavior and emotional dependence. She wanted to understand what had failed her so badly that it destroyed something that could have been her forever home. Regret was a constant presence, but no longer the kind that paralyzed her. Now it was a reminder. A pain that pushed her forward, not backward. She knew she wouldn't win Lucas back, and that had become a concrete truth, no longer a secret hope. But even without him, she wanted to become someone he would respect if he saw her from afar. She wanted to be a better woman, not for others, but because she finally understood how cruel she had been to herself. In one of her therapy sessions, she spoke about the exact moment she felt she'd lost everything. It wasn't the breakup, nor the goodbye, nor even the silence that followed. It was that frozen instant when she saw Clara beside Lucas at the art fair and realized he was happy. Not a performative happiness, not an attempt to show the world he'd overcome it, it was real. The way he touched her arm when he spoke, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he looked at her lightly. And it was in that detail that Emma understood, with a lump in her throat, that she had never allowed Lucas to love freely, without fear, without pressure. Because, from the beginning, she hadn't known how to let herself be loved without suspicion, without doubt, without expecting the worst. And when you live expecting the worst, sometimes you provoke it. Lucas began to find more meaning in the little things. He began painting again, even if only for distraction. Sometimes Clara would sit beside him with a book, while he tried to capture colors that resonated with what he was feeling. It was a way to express himself without overexposing himself. She began traveling on weekends, visiting nearby cities, seeking new landscapes. She no longer needed to escape what she'd experienced, but she also didn't want to be trapped in the constant memory of a time that would never return. He carried in his heart a mixture of gratitude and caution. He knew that, on some level, the pain he'd experienced had made him more whole, but also more attentive. And this attentiveness made him appreciate the present he had with Clara even more, even if it wasn't a fairy tale. The dilemma now looming in his mind was silent but intense. What to do when the pain has passed, but the scar remains? How to move on completely free when you know that, somewhere in the past, someone carries regrets you can never alleviate? Clara, with her calm wisdom, said that not all forgiveness needs to fix what was broken. Sometimes it only serves to show that we are greater than what hurt us. Lucas reflected on this constantly. He had already forgiven Emma, but he didn't know if, deep down, she truly needed that forgiveness to move on. Perhaps true forgiveness was the one she should give herself, and that wasn't something he could do for her. Emma, for her part, began to write. Not to be read, but to be heard. She filled notebooks with letters to herself, with memories, with regrets, with apologies that had no recipient. It was her way of organizing the chaos that still existed within her. And, one rainy afternoon, she decided to reread everything she had written in the last few months. She cried. Not with absolute sadness, but with the knowledge that that pain was also part of her healing. She finally realized that losing Lucas had been inevitable. Not because of an isolated mistake, but because of a succession of neglects of the love they had received. And this, devastating as it was something she needed to accept. Some losses don't teach you how to win someone back, but rather to teach you how to never lose someone again, even if it's to someone else. While Emma came to terms with her loneliness, Lucas and Clara confronted together the depths of what it means to start over. It wasn't enough to love, they had to learn to trust again. And, every now and then, that trust was still tested, not because Clara did anything wrong, but because Lucas still carried remnants of a time when he'd been deceived behind her back. One such night, after a silent dinner, Clara looked him in the eye and told him it wasn't fair to pay the price for something he didn't do. Lucas took a deep breath and replied that he knew it. And that he was trying every day not to let his scars dictate the steps he took with her. It was a tense moment, but also profound. Because there, in that difficult conversation, a new kind of intimacy was born, an intimacy that doesn't need to feign strength all the time. The following weeks were marked by silent reconciliations. Not with Emma, but with the past as a whole. Lucas stopped avoiding certain places, reconnected with old friends, accepted invitations he'd previously declined for fear of bumping into memories. It was as if he were, little by little, untying the knots that bound him to pain. And the freedom he felt now was lighter than any escape he'd ever attempted. Clara noticed the changes. And, without saying much, she stayed there, by his side, watching. Because I knew that true love doesn't require haste, it waits, respects, embraces. And it was precisely at this point in the journey that something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten, with no clear return address. Lucas recognized the handwriting. It was Emma's. But what was inside wasn't another apology, nor an attempt at reconciliation. It was a letter of closure. Emma said that, for the first time, she felt she could let him go completely. That she was grateful to have loved someone like him, and that she sincerely hoped he would be happy. She said she had learned from the pain, and that this letter was the last bridge between them. Lucas read it, folded the paper carefully, and put it in a box where the few things that remained from that time were kept. Not as a memento, but as a record. A necessary final point, delivered with dignity. This letter brought neither sorrow nor relief. It only confirmed that life, however hard, knows how to reorganize itself when we accept leaving the past in its proper place. And it was with this feeling that Lucas, that very night, took Clara to the balcony. He looked at the sky, felt the wind on his face, and, with a slight smile, said he was now ready. He didn't explain exactly what for. But she understood. Because sometimes, being ready doesn't mean knowing the next step, but being at peace with those left behind. And so, the stage was set for an outcome that wouldn't require grand gestures, but whole truths. Because, in the end, what remained was something rarer than love, the awareness of what it requires to exist. And that awareness, now, was alive in both of them. Clara received an offer for a short work stint abroad, a cultural project in Lisbon that would last 2 months. It wasn't permanent, but it was enough to prompt a change of pace for the couple. The news arrived on a calm afternoon, when the sun beat down lazily on the balcony where they usually sought refuge from life's pressures. Clara explained the invitation with the care of someone who didn't want to hurt anyone, but also didn't want to give up something important to them. Lucas listened attentively, without interrupting. After everything he'd been through, he'd learned to listen without interpreting anything that sounded like distance as a threat. When she finished, he was silent for a few seconds and then calmly told her she should go, that there would be no hard feelings. And what made that moment so different from others she'd experienced was precisely this: there was no burden. Just the mature acceptance that individual paths, when well cared for, don't need to disrupt shared ones. Clara smiled with relief, touched his hand across the table, and said she didn't want to leave him, she just wanted to find herself, for a while. And Lucas understood, more than anyone, what that meant. When they said goodbye at the airport, they didn't make emotional promises. They didn't swear eternal fidelity or create unrealistic expectations. They hugged tightly, and in his ear, Clara simply said, "If it's going to continue, let it continue lightly." He nodded and watched as she walked through the boarding gate, disappearing into the glass corridor. He returned home alone, but not sad. He missed her, of course, but there was a kind of longing in her absence that didn't tear. It was like a comfortable silence, a necessary pause. He used the days to dedicate more time to painting, to small adjustments around the house, to readings he'd neglected. The apartment seemed larger, but not empty. It was as if the space now breathed with him. It was during this period that Emma crossed his path for the last time. It happened by chance, in a small café tucked away on a street he used to frequent when they were still together. Lucas walked in distracted, just waiting for a coffee, and saw her sitting in the corner, a book open in front of her, her gaze lost in the cup between her hands. She saw him almost immediately, and their eyes met, an inevitable pause in time. He hesitated for a moment, then approached with a polite gesture. She smiled shyly and invited him to sit. The conversation began with trivialities, the weather, the coffee, the neighborhood, which had changed little. But soon they delved into deeper waters. Emma told him she had started teaching literature, that she worked less, that she lived alone. She said she still wrote, that she had published texts in an independent magazine. Lucas praised her, genuinely impressed. She smiled with a mixture of pride and melancholy, like someone who has finally rebuilt herself, but knows the cost of each brick. The most delicate moment came when she mentioned Clara. She knew about the relationship, having learned about it through mutual friends, and asked how he was doing. Lucas responded with a glint in his eye that he hadn't even noticed, and Emma simply nodded, staring into her own cup as if hiding a universe of unsaid things within. After a long silence, she looked into his eyes and said, "You know, I needed to lose you to understand what it truly means to be loved completely. And more than that, what it means to be someone capable of receiving that love without destroying it." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He simply held her gaze for a few seconds, then said calmly, "I know you've changed. And I'm happy about that. Because in the end, life needs to be fair to those who learn." There was no hurt, no tension. It was a final point, spoken quietly, with the maturity of someone who no longer expected new beginnings, but recognized the importance of what had been experienced. They said goodbye with a long, firm hug. Lucas left the coffee shop with a feeling hard to define. It wasn't relief, nor sadness. It was a deep acceptance. As if a story long closed had finally received its final page. Emma stood there, looking out the window at the street, and for the first time in a long time, she felt she could breathe without carrying guilt like a chain. Because, in that moment, she understood that Lucas was at peace. And that was all she needed to know. With Clara physically distant, but still present in constant exchanges of messages, calls, and videos, Lucas realized how much he had matured emotionally. He no longer felt insecure, no longer waiting for answers, no longer harboring the fear of being abandoned. Time had done its work, and now he was a different man, no longer one who needed to prove his worth, but one who knew his own worth without needing to assert it. When Clara returned 2 months later, he met her at the airport gate with a calm smile and a steady heart. She hugged him tightly and said, "It's good to be back." He replied, "It's good to see you back." The days resumed their rhythm, but now there was a new layer of connection between them, as if the space between them had further strengthened the bond they had been building. They began to talk about the future more clearly, not in terms of dependence, but of partnership. They discussed the idea of moving in together soon, of sharing more than just routine, but concrete plans, shared dreams. Clara told them she had been invited to lead an art curatorship at a cultural center that would open in a few months, and Lucas was genuinely happy. He was rediscovering the joy of rooting for someone and being part of their growth, without feeling like his presence was disposable. He knew that, this time, he was with someone who knew how to sustain love with truth. One night, sitting on the same porch as always, Clara held his hand and asked if he felt he had truly ended all cycles. Lucas was silent for a few seconds before answering. He said yes. That there were pains that might never completely disappear, but were now just part of the internal landscape. And that, despite everything, he was grateful to have gone through it, because without that collapse, he might never have rebuilt himself with the lucidity and strength he now possessed. Clara squeezed his hand affectionately, rested her head on his shoulder, and said, "It's beautiful when we survive ourselves." And he knew it was true. Lucas finally understood that love isn't about perfection, but about presence. About being there, even when you don't know what to say. About listening, even when you don't understand. About forgiving, not to hold on, but to free. And that sometimes, the greatest act of love someone can do for themselves is to walk away from a place where they can no longer flourish. Watching Clara sleeping beside him that night, her breathing calm and her face serene, Lucas felt, clearly, that he had finally arrived at the right place. And that place wasn't just Clara, it was himself, whole, firm, ready. Life would still bring its ups and downs, but now he knew, what matters isn't avoiding falls, but choosing who to rise with. And for the first time in a long time, there was no room for doubt. He had chosen, and he had been chosen. With truth. With respect. With love. It was on an ordinary late afternoon that Lucas decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time, sit down and write. Not professionally, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to record what he was experiencing so intensely inside. He picked up a blank notebook he had bought months ago and wrote just one sentence on the first page: "Some stories have no return, and yet, they are the ones that transform us the most." Rereading those words, he felt a silent firmness in his chest, as if every piece of him, once shattered by love and disillusionment, was now in its rightful place. He wasn't a man who won out of wounded pride or a thirst for revenge. He was someone who chose to be greater than the pain he experienced. Someone who understood that love, when it becomes a field of lies and omissions, disintegrates. And what remains afterward cannot be rebuilt in the same way. Lucas and Clara moved into a house in the countryside months later. Small, full of windows, with a garden that Clara tended with dedication and where Lucas spread unfinished canvases, paintings that blended colors he didn't even know he knew how to use. Mornings were filled with silence and fresh coffee, afternoons with music and work, nights with conversations that sought not reason, but presence. They didn't idealize the future. They just lived. And that, just, carried immeasurable value. Because living, after the storm, with lightness and reciprocity, was all he needed. Clara became his shelter without taking away his own roof. She was a woman, a friend, a companion. And, perhaps most importantly, she wasn't the result of an escape. She was the choice one makes when one learns to respect oneself. Emma, for her part, chose to no longer live among the ruins of what she had destroyed. Clearly aware that she could not erase the past, she began to transform it into something that could at least serve others. She volunteered on projects that offered psychological support to women undergoing self-discovery and emotional reconstruction. She created an anonymous blog, where she published chronicles inspired by real mistakes, often her own, using writing as confession, catharsis, and surrender. She gained readers who were moved by her raw honesty, without needing to know who was behind those words. Although she still carried shadows, she learned to no longer define herself by them. She knew she would never get back the man who loved her completely, but that was no longer an open wound, it was a lesson tattooed on her skin. She no longer desperately sought another love, because now she knew that love is not sought like someone seeking a cure. Love is a consequence of who we become. And Emma, even amidst her setbacks, was striving to be a better person. Still, there were nights when she stared at the ceiling and wondered what her life would have been like if she had chosen courage instead of cowardice. But in those moments, she would close her eyes and whisper to herself, "I lost someone who loved me. But I learned to love myself. May that be enough for me." Time passed. Years passed. And one day, by pure chance or calculated fate, Emma received a call from a publisher interested in turning her blog into a book. He said her words resonated with readers, that there was truth there, and that truth, when well told, deserved space. She accepted with a trembling heart, not out of vanity, but for the chance to transform her pain into something useful. In the book's dedication, she wrote simply, "To the one who once loved me completely. May his peace be eternal." And so, between printed pages, the last part of her story with Lucas found the rest it deserved. Lucas never knew about the book. He never read the chronicles. But one night, as Clara put on an old record, he found himself thinking about the past with a tenderness that surprised him. It was strange to look back at everything he'd experienced with Emma and realize there was no more resentment. Just the awareness that certain stories exist to teach us how far we can go for someone, and when we need to return for ourselves. He took Clara's hand, twirled her gently around the room as if in an improvised dance, and, at the end of the song, whispered, "Thank you for waiting for the right time for me." Clara smiled and replied, "Thank you for not giving me what was left, but what you rebuilt." The end of that story didn't come with fireworks, dramatic twists, or miraculous redemptions. It came with choices. With real consequences. With growth. Emma lost the love of her life, but not herself. Lucas lost the woman he chose first, but found another he chose last, and that difference was everything. The betrayal destroyed what was between them, but it didn't condemn them to bitterness. Because when there's the courage to start over, even with scars, it's possible to find peace on the other side of the end. If you've made it this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. What would you do in each character's shoes? How would you handle such a betrayal? Your opinion matters a lot and enriches each story we tell here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with real, touching, and profound stories like this one. This story clearly shows how betrayal has the power to devastate not only a relationship, but everything around it: trust, dreams, dignity, the essence of what two people have built. When someone cheats, they don't just betray the other person. They betray their own word, their own commitment, their own truth. There is no romance in betrayal. There is no beauty in cowardice. Therefore, this channel does not support, encourage, or justify any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to stories that warn, that move, and that leave their mark, not because they are perfect, but because they are human. And the greatest lesson is simple and definitive: love, to last, must be loyal. Because loyalty is the foundation of everything. When it breaks, what is broken cannot be put back together in the same way. And those who truly love do not risk losing what they will never find again.